Your system is not broken, Mr. Vaughn. It is waiting for a moment that already happened. The sentence crossed the private dining room without force, yet every conversation stopped beneath it. Richard Vaughn stood at the head of a walnut table, one hand resting beside a cold cup of coffee, the other clenched around the edge of a leather presentation folder. On the wall behind him, a 75-inch display glowed red with the same message it had shown 3 times in 6 minutes. Transfer failed. 10 investors sat beneath the amber lights of the Wellington room, their attention moving between Richard and the miniature hospital grid arranged across the center of the table. The model had been designed to impress them. Tiny emergency rooms, surgical wings, and intensive care units waited beneath clear acrylic roofs. Each building was connected to Atlas Relay, the system Richard's company had spent 4 years and nearly $60 million developing. Tonight, it was supposed to prove that a hospital could lose its primary electrical supply and transfer to backup power without interrupting a single critical machine. Instead, the model remained dark. Rain traced narrow paths down the tall windows overlooking Boston. Richard's Swiss watch showed 8:42 in the evening. The digital clock in the corner of the control screen showed 1:42 in the morning. No one at the table seemed to notice the difference. Lauren Hayes did. She stood behind Richard's chair with a silver coffee pot held steadily in both hands. Her black uniform was simple, her light brown hair secured in a neat knot, and her expression revealed nothing beyond professional patience. To the investors, she was part of the service. To the engineers, she was someone who should not be looking at their screens. To Richard, until that moment, she had barely existed. He turned slowly. At 56, Richard had built Vaughn Energy Systems by treating hesitation as a defect. He had crossed boardrooms, laboratories, and government offices with the same belief. Problems yielded to pressure if the right person applied enough of it. Now a waitress had interrupted the most important demonstration of his career with a sentence that sounded impossible. "What did you say?" he asked. Lauren glanced toward the 2 clocks. "The relay is not refusing the transfer because the power test failed." Caleb Monroe, the company's chief technology officer, straightened beside the control console. "That is not something you can determine from across the room." Lauren did not look at him. Her attention remained on the display. "The system believes the transfer window has not opened yet." A faint smile appeared on the face of one investor, not because he understood her, but because he expected Richard to dismiss her. Across the table, Nora Bell lowered her eyes toward a tablet covered in system logs. She had tried to mention the timestamps twice. Both times, Caleb had moved the discussion back to voltage levels and network traffic. Richard followed Lauren's gaze to the screen. "You were telling me that a $100 million contract is being held up by a clock. I am saying 2 clocks are telling the system 2 different truths." The room became quiet enough for the rain to sound louder. Richard looked from the red warning to his watch, then back to Lauren. His coffee had gone cold 20 minutes earlier, untouched while his engineers restarted servers, replaced cables, and repeated the same failed sequence. "And you believe you can fix it?" he asked. Lauren set the coffee pot on the sideboard. "I believe the people in this room have been checking the power when they should have been checking the time." Richard's jaw tightened. The investors were watching him now, not the system. Pride moved faster than judgment. He pointed toward the control console and said, "Then fix it, and I will give you the entire $100 million. A few people laughed softly. Lauren did not. She looked at Nora and asked one question. "Which clock is the relay trusting?" 45 minutes earlier, the Wellington room had looked less like a restaurant than a private command center hidden above downtown Boston. The long walnut table had been cleared of place settings and rebuilt around a miniature hospital complex, a row of control screens, and several sealed equipment cases marked with the Vaughn Energy Systems emblem. Soft amber light reflected from polished silver and dark glass, while rain moved steadily across the windows overlooking the city. At the head of the table, Richard Vaughn reviewed the final presentation notes without touching the dinner placed beside him. He had invited 10 representatives from a regional hospital alliance, 3 private investors, and 2 members of his senior technical team. By morning, if the demonstration succeeded, the alliance would authorize the next stage of a $100 million agreement to install Atlas Relay across medical centers in Massachusetts, Connecticut, and Rhode Island. Richard treated the evening as a formality. He had seen the system work inside laboratories, manufacturing facilities, and controlled simulations. Tonight was supposed to prove that it could function in a setting where decision-makers could watch every light change with their own eyes. Lauren Hayes entered carrying a tray of coffee cups just as Caleb Monroe began explaining the miniature hospital grid. She moved quietly along the wall, placing each cup without interrupting the presentation. Her black uniform was pressed, her name tag straight, and her expression calm. No one asked whether she understood the equipment. No one imagined she might. To the people seated around the table, Lauren belonged to the same category as the glassware and the linen napkins. Useful, present, easily forgotten. She did not mind being overlooked. She had learned that invisible people often heard the clearest version of the truth. At the control station, Nora Bell checked a sequence of system logs on her tablet. She was 31, younger than nearly everyone else representing the company, and she carried the careful tension of someone who had spent months trying to make technical concerns sound harmless enough for executives to hear. Lauren noticed Nora compare the wall clock with the time displayed on the nearest monitor. 8:10 in the evening on the wall, 1:10 in the morning on the screen. Nora frowned, opened a configuration window, then closed it when Caleb called her name. "Ready for the primary transfer test?" he asked. Nora hesitated. "I want to confirm the synchronization settings first." Richard looked up from his notes. "We confirmed them yesterday. The scheduling server and the relay controller may be reading different time standards after the update." Caleb gave a short breath through his nose. The update passed validation. Nora turned the tablet toward him. "The logs show a 5-hour offset." Richard checked his watch. "Does it affect the transfer?" "It could affect the authorization window." "Could" is not an answer. Nora's fingers tightened around the tablet. "I need 5 minutes to verify it." Richard closed the leather folder in front of him. "The investors arrive in less than 10. We are not delaying a 4-year project over a clock setting." Nora looked toward Caleb, waiting for support. He glanced at the equipment, then at Richard. "We can run the test. If there is an issue, the system will identify it." The decision settled over the room before Nora could complete another sentence. Lauren stood near the sideboard with the coffee pot in her hand. She had seen the same symbol in the corner of the monitor that once appeared in electrical systems textbooks and laboratory simulations. Coordinated Universal Time. The wall clock was showing Eastern Time. 5 hours apart. She said nothing. Not yet. Richard rose as the first investors entered, his confidence returning with each handshake. Behind him, Nora opened the synchronization report one more time. Across the top of the page, a warning had been marked for executive review 3 weeks earlier. Its status remained unchanged. Deferred. 5 years earlier, Lauren Hayes had spent her nights in a very different kind of room. It was a basement laboratory at Northeastern University, filled with humming cabinets, tangled test leads, and whiteboards crowded with equations that remained visible long after midnight. She had been 24 then, younger than most of the graduate researchers, and more patient than nearly all of them. While others rushed toward results, Lauren preferred to understand why a system failed before asking it to run again. Her specialty was distributed electrical networks, the invisible architecture that allowed hospitals, transit systems, and emergency facilities to share power without losing control. She could spend hours studying a fault that lasted less than a second. To her, small delays were never small. A missed signal, an incorrect timestamp, or a single machine operating under the wrong assumption could separate a stable network from a failed one. Her professors noticed. So did the engineering firms that began asking when she would be available for interviews. For a while, Lauren believed her future had already taken shape. Then her father became ill. At first, she tried to balance everything. She attended lectures in the morning, worked in the laboratory until evening, and drove 40 miles north to help him with appointments, medication schedules, and the ordinary tasks that had suddenly become difficult. She told herself the arrangement was temporary. One semester became 2. Deadlines moved closer. Sleep became shorter. The university offered leave, then extensions, then one final decision. Lauren folded her unfinished research notes into a cardboard box and told her advisor she would return when life became manageable again. Life did not become manageable. Medical bills accumulated. Her father needed more care. The savings he had built over 30 years disappeared quietly, one payment at a time. Lauren took restaurant work because the shifts were flexible and the tips arrived immediately. By the time her father passed away, the laboratory had moved on without her. New students occupied the desks. Her research project had been reassigned. The firms that once called had stopped calling. Lauren did not resent them. Systems moved forward. That was what systems did when no one interrupted them. She kept her textbooks in a closet and her old student identification card in the back of a kitchen drawer. Occasionally, after a late shift, she opened a technical journal online and read until the words blurred. She never stopped understanding the language. She only stopped speaking it where anyone could hear. Now, inside the Wellington room, that language had returned through a small symbol in the corner of a screen. Coordinated Universal Time. Eastern Time. 5 hours apart. Lauren watched Nora reopen the deferred synchronization report, while Caleb welcomed the investors and Richard described Atlas Relay as the most reliable emergency transfer platform ever developed by his company. The words were polished. The room approved of them. Lauren stood beside the coffee service and looked again at the two clocks. One showed the time the people believed. The other showed the time the machine believed. She knew enough to understand that neither clock was necessarily wrong. The danger was that no one had told the system they were describing the same moment. Nora glanced up and briefly met Lauren's eyes. There was no recognition between them, only the quiet exchange of two people who had noticed the same detail and understood that the room had already decided it was unimportant. Richard raised his hand, and the investors turned toward the hospital model. "Let us begin," he said. Lauren tightened her grip on the silver coffee pot. Somewhere beneath the table, relays clicked into sequence. On the control screen, the authorization timer continued counting toward a future that had already arrived. The first transfer test began with a soft mechanical hum beneath the table. On the miniature hospital grid, the primary power lights glowed white across the emergency wing, the surgical floor, and the intensive care unit. Caleb Monroe stood beside the control console and explained each step with the confidence of someone who had repeated the sequence dozens of times. At his signal, the simulated utility feed dropped. The white lights vanished. For half a second, the room held its breath. Then the backup system should have taken control. It did not. A red message appeared across the main display. Transfer failed. The hospital model remained dark. One investor shifted in his chair. Another glanced toward Richard Vaughn, waiting to see how much concern the moment deserved. Richard gave them none. "Reset it," he said. Caleb opened a diagnostic panel. "The voltage readings are normal. Network response is normal. The relay is receiving the transfer request." Nora Bell leaned closer to her tablet. "The authorization window is not matching the event time." Richard looked at her. "What does that mean?" "The controller believes the scheduled test begins later. Later than now. 5 hours later, based on the timestamp." Caleb moved quickly through the system logs. "That should not prevent a manual transfer." Nora pointed to a line near the bottom of the screen. "The safety protocol still requires the schedule server to confirm the window." Richard turned toward Caleb. "Run the test again." Nora tried to speak. "We should correct the time conversion first." Richard did not raise his voice. He did not need to. "We are not stopping the demonstration over a display setting." The second test began. Lauren stood near the sideboard with a fresh coffee pot, watching the same sequence repeat. Primary power off. Transfer request sent. Authorization pending. Transfer failed. This time the silence lasted longer. Caleb disconnected one network cable and replaced it with another. He asked a technician to restart the relay controller. Nora opened the synchronization report again and placed it beside the console where Richard could see it. "The issue was flagged after the last update," she said. "The scheduling server is using Eastern Time, but the controller is logging Coordinated Universal Time without conversion." Richard glanced at the report, but not long enough to read it. "Then why did validation pass?" "Because the laboratory tests were run under one time standard. So this was missed." Nora hesitated. "It was reported." That answer changed the temperature of the room. Richard looked at Caleb. Caleb looked at the report. At the top of the page, the warning carried a date from 3 weeks earlier. Beneath it was a status line. "Deferred for executive review." Richard's eyes moved past it, as if the words belonged to someone else. "We are not discussing internal process in front of investors," he said. "Fix the system." Nora lowered her gaze. "The system is doing exactly what it was told to do." Richard turned back to the model. "Then tell it something useful." A few people smiled uneasily, relieved to hear authority return to his voice. Lauren did not. She watched Nora close the report and step away from the console. On the wall, the analog clock showed 8:37 in the evening. On the display, the system clock showed 1:37 in the morning. The third test failed at the same point. Caleb began checking voltage levels again. Richard asked for new cables. One investor quietly folded his notes. Another reached for his phone. Everyone searched for a complicated failure because a simple one felt too embarrassing to accept. Lauren moved toward Richard with the coffee pot. As she filled his cup, her eyes passed from his Swiss watch to the digital timestamp and back again. 5 hours. The machine was not confused about electricity. It was confused about when permission began. Richard noticed her looking. "Is there something you find interesting?" he asked. The room turned toward her. Lauren set the coffee pot down carefully. "Only that both clocks may be correct," she said. "They are just not speaking the same language." For 1 second, Richard Vaughn said nothing. The room waited for him to decide whether Lauren's observation deserved an answer. Caleb Monroe looked irritated. Nora Bell looked alert. The investors looked entertained in the cautious way people do when they suspect someone else is about to be embarrassed. Richard glanced from the wall clock to the screen, then back to Lauren. "And what exactly do you know about system timing?" he asked. His voice remained controlled, but the question carried enough distance to remind everyone where she stood. Lauren rested both hands lightly against the edge of the sideboard, enough to know that a transfer window can fail even when the power path is healthy. Caleb gave a short laugh. "That is not how this platform works." "Then why does the authorization request keep waiting?" Lauren asked. The question was simple. That made it harder to dismiss. Nora looked down at her tablet again. Caleb turned toward the console. Richard noticed the exchange, and his patience thinned. "We have engineers in this room," he said. "People who built the system." Lauren nodded. "Then one of them can answer which clock the relay is trusting." A few investors looked toward Nora. She opened the event log and zoomed in on the timestamp column. "The controller is reading Coordinated Universal Time," she said. Caleb leaned closer. "The schedule server should be converting that automatically." "It is not." Richard tapped one finger against the table. "Then convert it." "I need access to the deployment settings," Nora said. "Caleb has administrator control." Caleb did not move immediately. Changing the time source during a live demonstration could create a second fault. Lauren watched the control screen. The authorization timer was still counting forward, waiting for a window that had already passed in the room but had not yet arrived in the machine. Richard saw one of the hospital representatives close her folder. Another checked his watch. The failure was no longer technical. It was becoming public. "How long?" he asked Caleb. "At least 20 minutes to verify safely." Richard's expression hardened. "We do not have 20 minutes. He turned toward Lauren again. "You seem very certain." "I am certain the clocks disagree." "That was not my question." "Then ask the one you mean." The room went quiet. Lauren had not raised her voice. She had not challenged his authority directly. Still, the sentence reached him with the weight of something no one else had been willing to say. Richard stepped away from the table and faced her fully. "Do you believe you can solve this faster than my team?" Lauren looked at Nora, not at Caleb. "I believe she already knows where to look." Nora's face changed, just slightly. Richard followed Lauren's gaze. "Then why is the system still down?" Nora opened her mouth, but Caleb answered first. "Because this is not a restaurant problem." Richard's frustration found a target. He pointed toward the console. "Fine. If the waitress can fix what the engineering team cannot, she can have the entire $100 million. A few people laughed under their breath. Lauren did not react to the money. She did not smile, step back, or apologize. She moved toward Nora and stopped beside the control station. On the screen, the red warning remained unchanged. Lauren studied the timestamp, the authorization window, and the delayed status line. Then she asked, "Does the relay trust the schedule server, or does it trust its own local clock?" Nora answered immediately, "The schedule server." "And which time standard is the schedule server sending?" Nora turned the tablet so they could both see. "Eastern Time." Lauren looked at Caleb. "Then the system is not waiting for electricity. It is waiting for 5 hours that do not exist." Nora stared at the log as if the answer had been waiting for permission to become visible. "The schedule server is sending Eastern Time," she said. "The relay controller is comparing it directly against Coordinated Universal Time." Caleb Monroe stepped closer to the console. "That still does not explain why the manual command failed." It does if the safety layer validates the request against the scheduled window before allowing the transfer, Lawrence said. The system is not rejecting the power path. It is rejecting the time. Richard Vaughn looked from Lauren to Nora. Can you prove that without creating another problem? Nora moved through the settings carefully. Yes. We can compare the authorization token with the event timestamp. We do not need to change the hardware. Caleb folded his arms. You are making assumptions. Lauren turned toward him. Then test the assumption. Her voice carried no triumph, only clarity. Nora opened two log files side by side. On the left, the schedule server listed the transfer window at 8:40 in the evening, Eastern Time. On the right, the relay controller recorded the same request at 1:40 in the morning, Coordinated Universal Time. The system had treated them as separate moments rather than the same moment expressed under different standards. The investors leaned forward now. The problem that had seemed impossibly technical had become understandable in a single glance. Richard noticed that. He also noticed Nora's hands were no longer trembling. What needs to change? He asked. The conversion step, Nora said. The update removed it from the authorization sequence. Caleb shook his head. We cannot rewrite the sequence during a live demonstration. We do not have to, Lawrence said. Set the schedule server to Coordinated Universal Time for this test, then reset the authorization window. One standard, one clock. Caleb looked at Richard. That is a temporary workaround, not a final repair. Can it damage the system? Richard asked. No. Can it falsify the result? No, then do it. Caleb hesitated just long enough for everyone to notice. Nora reached toward the keyboard, but her access level stopped at the deployment screen. Caleb entered his credentials. The configuration window opened. He changed the schedule server from Eastern Time to Coordinated Universal Time, then paused over the confirmation button. Once I apply this, the current session will restart. Richard looked at the dark hospital model. The current session has already failed 3 times. Caleb confirmed the change. The main display went black. For 3 seconds, the room reflected itself in the empty screen. Richard at the head of the table, Nora beside the console, Caleb standing between them, and Lauren in a waitress uniform with her hands resting calmly at her sides. Then the display returned. The clock in the corner now matched the controller. Nora reset the transfer window and checked the authorization token. A green line appeared beneath the timestamp. Valid. Lauren watched Richard's Swiss watch advance by 1 minute. Run the sequence again, he said. Nora initiated the test. The primary lights across the miniature hospital glowed white. The simulated utility feed dropped. Darkness covered the model. 1 second passed. Then another. The backup controller issued the transfer request. On the main display, the red warning did not return. Instead, a new message appeared. Authorization accepted. Caleb held his breath. Nora looked at Lauren. Richard said nothing. Beneath the table, a row of relays clicked in order, one after another, like a locked door opening from the inside. The miniature hospital came back to life in a quiet sequence of green light. First the emergency wing, then the surgical floor, then the intensive care unit. Each section illuminated in order, not with spectacle, but with precision. On the main display, the transfer time settled beneath the required threshold. Voltage held steady. Load balance remained stable. The room stayed silent until the final status line appeared. System operating normally. Nora Bell let out a breath she seemed to have been holding for weeks. Caleb Monroe stared at the screen, his earlier certainty replaced by the careful stillness of someone reviewing every assumption that had just failed him. Across the table, one of the hospital representatives reopened her folder. Another leaned closer to the model, watching the green indicators remain steady. Richard Vaughn did not look at the investors. He looked at Lauren Hayes. She stood beside the control station in the same black uniform, her hands relaxed, her expression unchanged. No victory, no satisfaction, only attention. How long did it take you to see it? Richard asked. Lauren glanced at the 2 clocks, now displaying the same standard. Long enough to notice that everyone was checking the power while no one was checking the time. No one laughed. The sentence carried no insult, yet it exposed the entire room. Richard turned toward Nora. You tried to tell us. Nora looked at the tablet in her hands. I reported the synchronization risk after the update. Caleb reached for the deferred report. The warning was categorized as non-critical because laboratory validation passed. Who categorized it? Richard asked. Caleb hesitated. Executive review. Richard's eyes narrowed. Which executive? Nora opened the approval history. The page showed a short note entered 3 weeks earlier. Focus the engineering team on visible performance risks. Defer secondary timing concerns until after the investor demonstration. The authorization field carried Richard Vaughn's name. He read it once, then again. The room changed around him. A few minutes earlier, the system failure had belonged to the engineers. Now the decision belonged to him. I wrote that, he asked, though the answer was already on the screen. Yes, Nora said. Her voice was respectful, but no longer uncertain. Richard remembered the meeting. He had been traveling between Chicago and Washington, reviewing 20 reports at once, pushing Atlas Relay toward a deadline he had promised the board. Nora's warning had looked small beside supply delays, certification reviews, and contract negotiations. He had not rejected it because he understood it. He had rejected it because it arrived without urgency in a week full of louder problems. Lauren stepped away from the console. She saw the issue first, she said. Richard looked at her. You solved it. I finished the sentence she was not allowed to finish. Nora raised her eyes. Caleb looked down at the report. The investors remained silent, but the silence no longer belonged to uncertainty. It belonged to recognition. Richard moved to the head of the table and closed the leather presentation folder. For years, he had believed leadership meant reducing noise until the right answer became obvious. Tonight, he saw the danger in deciding which voices were noise before hearing what they had found. He faced Nora in front of everyone. I dismissed your report without understanding it, he said. That was my failure, not yours. The apology was simple, but it cost him more than the challenge he had made to Lauren. Nora gave a small nod. Richard then looked at Lauren. And the $100 million? He asked. Lauren glanced at the illuminated hospital model. Keep the contract discussion separate from the lesson, she said. The system works now. The company still needs to learn why it nearly did not. Richard let the silence remain for several seconds. Outside, rain continued to move across the tall windows, but inside the Wellington room, the atmosphere had changed. The investors were no longer watching a failed demonstration. They were watching a company examine the reason it had nearly failed. Richard turned toward the hospital representatives. The system completed the transfer, he said. But tonight exposed a process weakness that matters more than a successful test. We will not ask you to approve anything until that weakness is independently reviewed. One of the representatives, a woman named Margaret Cole, closed her folder with measured care. You are delaying your own agreement? I am protecting your hospitals from a company that moved too quickly. Caleb Monroe looked toward him. Richard, the technical issue is resolved. The technical issue is resolved, Richard said. The leadership issue is not. He asked Norabelle to open the full review history on the main display. The record showed her original warning, the engineering notes that supported it, and the chain of approvals that had pushed the concern aside. Several managers had seen the report. None had challenged the decision after Richard marked it deferred. The problem had not disappeared. It had simply lost permission to matter. Nora stood beside the screen while Richard read every line. Were there other concerns handled this way? He asked. Caleb answered carefully. There may be items that were postponed because they did not affect visible performance. That is not what I asked. Caleb lowered his gaze. Yes, there are others. Richard removed his watch and placed it beside the cold coffee. For the first time that evening, he looked less like the man controlling the schedule and more like a man realizing what his schedule had controlled. Tomorrow morning, all deferred engineering warnings are reopened, he said. No report closes without a written response from an independent reviewer. Nora will lead the first audit. Nora looked surprised. I am not a department head. Tonight, you were the person who understood the risk before anyone with a higher title chose to hear it. Lauren watched Nora absorb the recognition she should have received weeks earlier. Richard then turned toward Lauren. You were right to give her credit. It belonged to her, Lauren said. I only recognized the pattern. Most people would have taken the moment for themselves. Most people know what it feels like to be ignored. Fewer remember that feeling when the room finally starts listening. Margaret Cole looked from Lauren to Richard. What about the $100 million you promised? A few faces shifted, uncertain whether the question was serious. Richard did not smile. I made the promise publicly. I will honor it. Lauren stepped closer to the table. Then do not give it to me. Richard studied her. You solve the problem. The money belongs to the work the problem exposed. She looked at the miniature hospital grid, still glowing green. Build an independent safety program. Fund research that engineers cannot be pressured to bury. Create scholarships for students who leave school because someone in their family needs them more than a classroom does. And protect the people who speak before a failure becomes visible. Nora looked at Lauren with quiet understanding. Caleb remained still, but the resistance in his expression had softened. Richard asked, "And who would run such a program?" Lauren glanced at Nora. "Someone technical enough to understand the warning and independent enough to refuse the deadline." Richard nodded slowly. "Then we begin with both of you." Lauren did not accept. "Not yet. First, change the rule," she said. "Then ask who is willing to trust it." Richard looked at the deferred report still glowing on the wall. He reached for his fountain pen, opened a blank page in the leather folder, and began writing a new policy before anyone left the room. The new policy did not remain a promise written in a private room. By the following morning, Richard Vaughn had suspended every pending approval connected to Atlas Relay and ordered an independent review of the entire testing process. The Hospital Alliance agreed to postpone its decision rather than abandon the project, provided that the results would be shared in full. For the first time in years, Richard did not treat delay as defeat. He treated it as evidence that something deserved a second look. Nora Bell was appointed to lead the technical review, with direct access to the board and the authority to reopen any concern that had previously been deferred. Caleb Monroe remained with the company, but his role changed. He was no longer the final voice on engineering risk. He became one voice among several, required to answer objections rather than move past them. The hardest change, however, belonged to Richard. He began attending review meetings without controlling the agenda. He listened to junior engineers finish their explanations. He asked what had been dismissed, not only what had been approved. At first, the silence before people spoke was uncomfortable. Then it became useful. 6 weeks later, the Hospital Alliance approved the next phase of the agreement after the system passed a full, independent evaluation. The $100 million did not become a prize for a single person. Richard placed the same amount into a long-term initiative called Open Signal, an independent program supporting electrical safety research, scholarships, and protected technical reporting. One part of the fund was reserved for students who had left school to care for family members and wanted a path back into engineering. Lauren Hayes received the first formal offer to help design that program. She read every line before accepting. Her title was Director of Independent Systems Review, but the title mattered less than the terms beneath it. She could publish findings without executive approval. She could pause any demonstration if safety questions remained unanswered. Nora would lead the technical team beside her, not beneath her. On Lauren's first morning, she returned to the Wellington room before sunrise. The miniature hospital grid was still there, packed carefully inside clear cases. The wall clock showed 7:15. The main system display showed the same time. Richard entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. He placed one beside Lauren and looked toward the synchronized clocks. "I had them checked twice," he said. Lauren gave a small smile. "Good systems should be checked by people who are allowed to disagree." Richard nodded. The lesson had cost him pride, time, and certainty, but it had saved something more valuable than a contract. It had saved his company from becoming the kind of place where truth needed permission from power. Lauren never asked to be celebrated as the woman who solved the problem. She knew the answer had already existed inside the company. Nora had seen it. The logs had shown it. The system had been warning them all evening. What changed was not the machine. What changed was who the room was finally willing to hear. How would you have responded if you had been in Lauren's place, surrounded by experts who believed your uniform defined your limits? Share your thoughts, and if stories about quiet intelligence, earned respect, and the courage to speak at the right moment stay with you. Subscribe and join us for the next one. Sometimes, the smartest person in the room is not the one with the highest title. Sometimes, she is the one carrying the coffee and noticing what everyone else has decided not to see.